Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It is Friday afternoon, May 14th, 2021, and my name is Lindsay Mintz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Indianapolis, Indiana, and joining me on this exclusive last-minute planned briefing, thankfully, is the Consul General of Israel to the Midwest. This is Aviv Ezra, who is joining us from his office in Chicago. Aviv is just an incredible leader and a powerful spokesman on behalf of a country that so many of us feel a strong connection to. Aviv has been the Consul General to the Midwest for going on 4 years now. I think this summer will be 4, and unfortunately he'll be moving on very soon, but we're grateful to have him with us today. Prior to your role as Consul General, he was in DC for 8 years, working with the Office of Congressional Affairs and the Israeli Ministry. He's been obviously in Israel and around the world. He's been a member of the Foreign Affairs Ministry since 1999. Also has served in Egypt and throughout the United States. I am running my way through your bio and not doing it much justice because I know people want from you. So I'm going to welcome. Aviv is going to speak for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, give us a sense of what's going on the ground. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. I have 2 JCRC board members with us. Isaacs is going to moderate the Q&A. So this is a first opportunity to say, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we get to as many as we can. And then Miriam Dant is our board president, and she will close us out and say thank you at the end of what will, 35, 45 minutes, knowing that you are very busy. Consul General Aviv Ezra, please, the floor is yours.
Well, Lindsay, first of all, as always, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the kind introduction. I always want to get my mother to hear these introductions. I really appreciate it. But thank you, thank the JCRC, thank the entire Federations of Indiana, and the state of Indiana as a whole. I mean, I know that when I'm invited to speak in Indiana, it's never about to try to persuade why Israel is on the right side of history. It's always the second level of how can we work together to enhance the bond between Israel and the United States, and how can we stand for Israel because Israel represents our values. So it's never about, hey, why is this, why is that? Now, by the way, questions are always welcome. Criticism is always welcome. And as you know, we've been working extensively hard in the last few years, as you said, and we know that Israelis have criticism towards some kind of policy, a different kind of policies that Israel has. But at the end of the day, and this is where I want to begin my kind of a first few wording is that we need to, historical junctions like this is at the moment, zoom out a little bit from the tactical certain incidents that are happening, which we can relate to, but look at the bigger picture. And this is what I would try to allude to during my first comments or remarks. A couple of seconds ago, when I came into the Zoom, you asked me how are my parents, how are my relative back in Israel, and I obviously we're going to speak about the strategic implication. We're going to speak about the generic effects, etc. But at the end of the day, it's first and foremost personal. And I just called my parents a couple of hours ago during the nighttime in Israel, 3 o'clock at night, and look, it has been a very extremely tense 72 hours. I have my 80-year-old father who has been in his house for the last year for COVID-19 reasons, but for the last 72 hours or more, he had to sit in shelters. Hearing the bombings and the ongoing rockets, we're talking about almost 2,100 rockets in 72 hours. We're talking about millions of Israelis, innocent civilians that are in shelters. We're talking about death. We're talking about injured. And this always brings me to that specific question, which I ask all the time when I go on interviews, and I've done about 30 of them in the last 72 hours, radio and TV. This question that we call the WWAD, what would America do? Because we look up to America, we see the values of America, we see ourselves looking up to America. We ask ourselves, what would America do in a situation like this, where not 2,000 rockets, not 200 rockets, not 20 rockets, a single rocket shelled over Indianapolis? Well, we know what America would do. We know what any other like-minded country would do, which is to exercise your right, our right, to self-defense. And this is exactly what's been happening right now vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the ongoing escalation with Hamas. Look, we will, I'm sure, going to be touching upon different kind of specific events, etc. that, as I said, happened during the last few weeks, maybe of the Ramadan, etc. But I want to, as I said, zoom out and ask ourselves, is this conflict about a specific real estate dispute or a specific stairways to the Damascus Gate? Or when we zoom out, do we see the clear picture that this conflict, including the one that we are at the moment, is a choice between standing behind a radical, vicious, murderous regime in the shape of Hamas? Or are we, as a like-minded, or other countries around the world and individuals, or are we supporting a liberal democracy fighting for its life and values that are shared values with the United States and many other liberal democracies in a very, very tough neighborhood? This is the junction of history that we're all at the moment. And this is what my colleagues are trying to express to the Europeans. And by the way, many of the European countries today are extremely strongly supporting Israel. The Chancellor of Austria just took a flag of Israel and put it on top of his office. The Prime Minister of the Czech Republic did the same. There's understandings of tens and tens of countries that understand that Israel, first of all, they condemn the rockets, they condemn the violence. Even if there are misunderstandings, it do not have to go through violence. And on top of that, they're expressing the support for Israel to be able to defend itself by itself, which is something that we did not have in the past, the ability to do that. And the reason is because our adversaries, you can say a lot of challenging things about them, but one of the good things that you should give them credit for, they're not shy about their intentions. They're not shy about their goals. And Hamas, it's just the easiest thing to do. You just, go check out their charter. What does it call for? And it's very specifically calling for hatred, killing of Jews, killing of Israelis, and final destination is full annihilation of the state of Israel. They're not shy about it. So first of all, I think it's wrong, and we should put aside the policy of ostrich, of saying, hey, this is, it's just an issue of maturity. They will grow out of it. No, they're not going to grow out of it. That's what they want to do, and they're working intensively to do it. Second, since 2014, since Operation Cast Lead, we as a country try to seek a certain kind of an equilibrium with Hamas to be able to live, in a sense, side by side. But what we've learned is that while we were focusing on trying to seek that equilibrium, the other side was intensively working and trying to be able to create, to find the vulnerabilities of Israelis and to create the ability to attack Israel. And this is exactly what's happening right now. And I think that, I know that the cabinet, the government, the Israeli government and our cabinet is looking today towards finding an exit strategy where Israel will express firmly and clearly to the other side that even though that's what they want to do, annihilation of Israel, we are not going to play ball with them and not going to cooperate with that, of course. But also, if they try and attempt to do it, we will extract a price tag from them that will create a deterrence. If we don't create that deterrence, we're going to find ourselves in these cycle of rockets every few years. Obviously, we know that we were following it. We knew that they were getting equipped by Iran, financed by Iran, equipped by Iran, supported by Iran, technology, know-how, experience, trainers. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that they are deterred from going after Israelis, Jews, and Israel as a whole, the same way we did with Hezbollah in the north. If you remember, Nasrallah, after the 2006 war, had an interview in which he said that he did not anticipate an enormous response like Israel actually did respond. And the reason we have a relatively quiet border with Hezbollah in the north, by the way, they're getting ready for future escalations, no doubt about it. But the reason that at this point it's a relatively quiet border is because they're deterred, because they know that we will respond fiercely. Because if they would not proceed, it's a counterintuitive kind of an argument. If you want to prevent going to war, you need to be willing and prepared to go to war. It's a little bit counterintuitive kind of, because if you don't want to go to war, why prepare to go to war? Because if you're not prepared, then the other side will perceive that as weakness and will go after you, and then you'll go to war. So the deterrence factor is crucial. And I think at this point, Israel is trying to extract a very high kind of a price tag from Hamas. So they will understand that shooting 2,100 rockets and killing innocent Israelis and innocent civilians is not the way to go about with Israel. Now, in this sense, I want to touch upon, talking about innocent civilians, I want to touch upon the fact that Hamas is actually not only going after Israeli civilian population, he's actually, which is, by the way, a war crime. They are actually committing a double war crime. Because not only that they're going after our civilians, as I mentioned, they're not shooting at military installation. They're trying on the sidelines, less than 10%. 90% of these 2,100 rockets are shot towards civilian centers, towards the cities. All the cities in Israel today are exposed. And you know that many of you have friends, family in Israel. You know that they're in shelters. And that is definitely a war crime. But they are not only doing that, they are also firing from within their own civilian population. And this is something that we have to repeat. We have to repeat our narrative. If we don't say that, people will not know it. As I said, I've been interviewed with 30 venues. People are familiar with that they're shooting from within schools, from within hospitals, from within commercial centers. They are shooting from within residential buildings. And why are they doing that? Because they know who the Israelis are. They know that we will feel reluctant to respond. And by the way, by doing that, they are committing, as I said, a second war crime. So in a sense, they are to be, I think, accountable for two war crimes. And this is very, very important to remember and to mention, of course. I want to touch upon, raise two additional points, and then maybe we can open it to, I don't want to just, Lindsay knows, when you give me a microphone, I just can't stop talking. So I'm limiting myself to two additional last points, and then we can open it to Q&A if that's what we are planning. The first point is the great support that is coming from the United States of America. Now, all the way from President Biden, that has spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu and expressed deep support for Israel and the support for Israel to defend itself, is the President. The Secretary of State Blinken has spoken to our Foreign Minister twice. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has spoken to our advisor twice. The level of the governors, including the great governor of Indiana that I've been texting back and forth with him, stands firmly behind the state of Israel. Many members of Congress, there are a few that are not, and I want to commend the leadership of this JCRC here that calls upon certain members that are looking in a way. You know what? I'll talk about that in just a second. But governors, many members of Congress in the hundreds, bipartisan, Republican and Democrats, state legislators, mayors, etc. The reason they're doing that is because they know that Israel is not only fighting its wars, it's actually fighting wars against radicals, that those radicals consider Israel the small Satan, but consider America the large Satan. I do want to go back to the point that I said earlier. There is a group of about 15 to 20 members of Congress that I think that are, they define themselves as ultra liberals, ultra progressive. I personally think that if you're ultra progressive, if you support human rights, if you're against human rights atrocities, if you support LGBTQ, you have to support the state of Israel, because neither Iran nor Hamas nor Hezbollah will look at human rights the same way that any progressive would look alike, and actually will hang LGBTQ member of their communities. They will do this. There is no freedom of media, no freedom of. So that for me, it's just sometimes mind-boggling to see progressive that are siding with these radicals. And don't get me wrong, Israel makes mistakes. Israel, as I said, is entitled to criticism. But sometimes it's really shocking to see these members of Congress that define themselves as liberal, and they are talking about human rights atrocities, and they're blaming Israel and not blaming Hamas, which decapitates heads of anyone that says anything against them. But I'm putting that aside. Everyone, of course, has his right to for freedom of speech, etc. And I do want to say that I think it's very, very important that the voices of the pro-Israeli community, like the JCRC, like the Federation, many others, are capable of trying to engage with these members and educate them. However, sometimes they are not willing to be educated, in the sense that they're cutting the ties, they're not responding. And I think what the JCRC has done vis-a-vis some of these members that are from Indianapolis, I think it's a great lesson, and this is the way we need to do, because as I said in the beginning, this is an historical junction that you need to be on the right side of history. Are you supporting a radical, vicious, murderous regime named Hamas, or a liberal democracy fighting for its life and values like Israel? So that's one angle by the administration. And the last point is that we, in the last few years, were very focused on building new bridges and paths for peace, vis-a-vis the Abraham Accords, on top of Egypt and on top of Jordan. There are new accords that have been signed with Bahrain and the UAE and Morocco and Tunisia and many others that are in the pipeline at this point. However, while we were doing that, we were pushing for peace, the other side, i.e. Hamas, was planning and creating these R&D efforts, research and development efforts, not to solve COVID-19, not to solve cancer, not to invest in their healthcare systems or in their education system, but rather to find innovative and creative ways to kill better Israelis or Jews through these precise ammunitions, guided missiles, etc., etc., etc. And I think it's a shame. It's a shame, and this is not where we need to be going. And hopefully, the Palestinian population majority will push back against Hamas. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to some Q&A with everybody.
Thank you, Consul General Ezra. I'm going to introduce Eli Isaacs. He is an officer of the JCRC and a local, longtime Hoosier-born member of the Jewish community, and he's looking forward to helping bring some questions forward that are coming from our attendees. So this is another good chance to remind folks to put questions in the Q&A. And the right of the first question always goes to the moderator. So I'm going to hand it over and step back for a minute. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much again for your time today. We've got about 20 minutes to get through as many of these questions as we possibly can. They're flooding in. I'm drinking from a fire hose just a bit, but we'll try to do the best we can to get all of them asked and answered. One of the first questions we received, and I think something important on everyone's mind, is there have been some rumors of potential negotiations of a ceasefire. What would it take? What kind of offer would need to be on the table for Israel to accept a ceasefire arrangement at this point?
As far as we are concerned, any ceasefire that will be concluded at the end of the day will have to incorporate in it a message to the Hamas that A, they made a huge mistake by going after Israel. B, that there is a price tag attached to what they've done. And C, that their population and their officers, once they go out of their hiding places, which at this point, as I said, is hiding behind babies and innocent civilians, when they come out after the ceasefire agreement that will be signed, when they come out, they would look left and they would look right, and they would understand that the price tag that is attached to what they have done is so critically wounding them that they will think twice for at least a decade or two, because I know it's not going to be forever, from deciding to go for another round with Israel. This is crucial, because if we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves with the same cycle, but in a shorter period of time. If the last one, as I said, was in 2014, today we're in 2021, we're talking about 7-year cycle. The harder or the harsher the consequences will be for Hamas leadership vis-a-vis the Palestinian, the Hamas installation and their leaders and their principles and their interests and their private homes, the more they will be hurt, the longer we're going to see a next cycle with them. No doubt about it.
Shifting gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about Hamas, but one of the other things that's going on right now, unfortunately, is some hostilities between Jews and Arabs who are Israeli citizens living in Israeli cities and towns. What's precipitating that? Should there have been more police involvement to begin with, and how do we get through that piece of this?
Well, you touched upon a topic that is actually, for me, much more disheartening, concerning, and a worrisome topic than what we've been discussing until now. And I will explain. Hamas, as I said, I don't have any expectations from them to lay their weapons, because I know where they're coming from, and it's full hatred, and they're not going to be willing in any way, shape, or form to cooperate with us. Therefore, I'm not surprised by the rockets. I'm not surprised by the quantity of the rockets, not surprised by the quality of the rocket. And I know that we have, at the end of the day, even though they are paralyzing our economy, making us pay a price vis-a-vis Ben Gurion Airport, killing people, etc., I know that at the end of the day, Israel has the ability to defend itself by itself. And I know that Israel's might, and this is a very important to point out right now here, a very important statement that I try to repeat all the time, even though you know it, but I think our narrative is not told enough. Israel is there, the people of Israel, in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, not just because of our military might, but because of our historical rights. And a military might is a necessary but not sufficient condition. You need to know what you're fighting for. So when it comes to the challenges coming from Hamas vis-a-vis the rockets and Hezbollah, we will know how to defend ourselves. They will make us pay dear prices, but we know how to defend ourselves. But to your question of the riots within the internal challenges within Israel vis-a-vis the Arab society, this is where I feel that it is a much more worrisome development, and I'll explain. I think the main point is that there is a major gap of expectation. In the last decade and a half, there has been a feeling within the public opinion and within the decision makers that the Arab society, which account to about 20% of the Israeli population, doesn't have to be necessarily Zionist and serve in the military or whatever, but understands that it's a win-win situation to participate in the state of Israel, participate in the economy, in the services, in the hospitals. By the way, 50% almost of the doctors are Israeli Arabs, nurses, services, economy, partnerships, business partnership. It was just fascinating as a diplomat, every few years coming back to Israel, every year visiting Israel and seeing how the level of participation was on the rise. Friendships were connected, and it was really a feeling that it's going to the right direction. The peak of that partnership and beginning of a partnership, the peak of it, was actually just a couple of weeks ago, where for the first time in history, an Israeli Arab party was for the first time supposed to be taking part in a coalition in the executive branch, so a part of the government. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the developments. So it was a huge expectation that they're going to be playing ball, being part of the society, of the Israeli society. Therefore, the responses, the riots, the violence, the lynchings, the riots of businesses is just so disheartening. And I feel that this will be a huge challenge for Israel now. Yes, there are some tactical reasons to that. The police force maybe was not with full might, maybe was not prepared enough, maybe did not expect it. But this is not the main point. These are all tactical explanations to what happened in the last couple of days. The question is, whether the strategic question was or is, are we talking about an extreme radical group that is creating this fuss and these riots? Or is it more than just a group of, I don't know, 1,000 people? I personally believe that we should not taint the entire Arab society as radicals. I think the majority of them would like to participate, would like to be part of what Israel represents. They understand it's a win-win situation. And I do, or maybe it's wishful thinking, but because I don't have data, but I do believe these are just radicals. However, Israel needs to respond against radicals, both with the Arab Israeli community, and by the way, also with Israeli Jews that think that they can take the law into their own hands and push back. This is why we have a country with a rule of law, with police strong or weak, but the police that should do their job, security agencies that are capable of assisting. And at the end of the day, hopefully, we're talking about a very small group of radicals that should be I think, arrested and going through a judicial process and pay a price, because this is a country with the rule of law.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about radicals on either side within Israel. We've talked about Hamas. Two other constituencies that a number of people are asking about are the Palestinian Authority. Curious if you could comment on status of that organization. I know they were just supposed to have elections, but did not.
Yes.
And then also, I think maybe most importantly in some of our communities' minds, the ordinary Palestinians who are not necessarily supporters of Hamas. Is there more that can be done to support them, protect them, avoid them becoming collateral damage?
I 100% agree with this differentiation, because, as I described earlier, Israel, as I said, signed peace accords with Egypt, with Jordan, with 5-6 Arab countries. So the differentiation today in the Middle East is no longer the differentiation between Israelis or Zionists and between Arabs. Rather, the differentiation is between moderates and radicals. And this is where gets a little bit tricky. I'll answer your question in a second in terms of the PA, in terms of the other segments of the population within the Palestinians, but it's part of what I'm trying to say, which is that if Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, UAE, they're all concerned, for example, about very radical forces like Iran, that puts them on the same side of Israel as the moderate forces in the Middle East. And the same way, if Turkey supports Hamas, Hezbollah, or Tehran working together with Tehran, for us, it's pretty clear where is the specific axis of radicals and where is the axis of moderates. To your question, we truly believe that the Palestinian Authority is the authority that represents the majority of the Palestinian people. We hope and we believe that the majority of the Palestinian people are not radicals, even though they're going through a process of incitement on an everyday basis through the media, through the religious system, through the education system, through the mosques. But we hope that they understand that it's not within their interest to be radicalized. As I said, there are forces that are trying to radicalize them, but we believe that the majority of them are not. And certainly for us, the Palestinian Authority is the body that we would like to, and we have begun a process with in the Oslo Accord. The idea is to have the ability to go forward with them in a sense that they will take responsibility. But that comes not only with rights, but also with responsibilities to what's happening at this point. So for example, if there, and this is what happened, this is what actually happened. The reason that everything escalated right now is exactly what you said. There was supposed to be elections a couple of weeks ago. Abu Mazen is 14 years, if I'm not mistaken, in control in a 4-year term. And Hamas knew, and Abu Mazen knew that Hamas is going to be gaining a lot of seats. And he canceled the election. And Hamas wanted to be relevant. And they decided that this is their time to escalate, not to represent the Palestinian people vis-a-vis Israel, but rather to show that they are the ones representing the Palestinian people vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority. And this is a political game. There's no doubt in my mind. So in a sense, Israel's interest, Israel is not going to be able to communicate with Hamas because of the reasons I explained beforehand. There's no talking to terrorists and those who want to annihilate you. The Palestinian Authority for us is the moderate force, is the one that we believe we can have a full negotiation with, is the one that we are expecting and calling for full negotiation with. Netanyahu has been talking about for years. It's 3 miles between Jerusalem and Ramallah. Why do we have to go to the UN? But they have to be A, willing, and be capable of taking control of what's happening on the ground. At this point, they're not.
You've talked about the canceled elections as one of the precipitating factors of the current hostilities. I think a lot of the media coverage also focuses quite a bit on what's been going on in Sheikh Jarrah and the proposed evictions. Can you touch on that a little bit? Talk about what we should know on that front. Sure.
I want to frame it for a second. Once again, this is again a tactical incident which should be addressed. Very complicated, and I'll say a few words about it. But that is not the reason of this escalation. These 2,000 rockets were the campaign was pre-planned, well organized. These rockets were built way in advance before the real estate dispute with certain elements within the Israeli system. So what happened, according to my understanding, is in 1948, Sheikh Jarrah's lands, some of them were possessed by Jews that lived there. And when the Jordanian authorities have taken control of it, they have displaced the Jewish families. They're talking about ethnic cleansing. I love it when they use these terms against Israelis, but they don't use it when it's themselves. They were displaced and they were denied their rights for their lands of whom they have deeds from before 1948. By the way, when they say to me, hey, don't talk to me about 1948, I said, listen, this is what you guys talk about 1948 all the time. So sometimes it's a little bit tricky because a little bit too many details. People don't have time for all these details, but I'll try to make it quickly. Anyway, in 1967, when Israel came back, 3 years later, there was a law that allowed Jews that have deeds for certain lands in certain areas to claim them. And this is what they're doing now vis-a-vis judicial system. And by the way, we're not talking about the entire neighborhood. We're talking about 6, 7, 8, 9 families that are building houses between 48 to 67 have built houses on land that does not belong to them. And when Israel took control, they did not evacuate them because that's not what we do. We don't do ethnic cleansing, as totally against whatever certain members of Congress here like to use all the time. And now, when the Jewish families are coming back with the deeds to prove that this is their land, the Arab families are saying, hey, but we lived here since 1948. And we have built our houses here. And there's a real estate dispute over there. Do you know how many Jewish families are being evicted because of real estate dispute every day in Israel? Hundreds and hundreds. Not because they're Jewish, because it's a real estate dispute. But it's the easiest thing for Hamas and for anti-Israelis to taint and to paint this I would say, judicial process in a nationalistic or racist reasons. And of course, it's not the case. Now, these cases are in court right now. A decision has not been made. However, since it's a country that has the rule of law, this is part of the process. Sometimes certain disputes are ruled against you. Doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish. But you see, it took me at least 3-4 minutes to explain it to you. It's much easiest to raise a flag and say, hey, Israel is evacuating 10 families or the entire Sheikh Jarrah because it's expelling Muslims and it's putting instead of them Jewish families, which is totally not the case. So a long answer to a short question, and by the way, it represents our challenge.
No, I appreciate it. One question I have, you talked a lot about deterrence, and I think that's always an objective, and has been in the various flare-ups that have occurred in the past. The long-term success or failure of relations, I think, is well beyond the scope of this conversation. But in the short term, what would a successful end to this operation look like?
Well, we've touched upon this. I think one of your first questions. I think I am not going to be able to put it in details because A, we don't have a specific detailed answer to something like that, and B, it's in the making and in the progress in terms of understanding where we want to achieve with this. But I can tell you, and I can define it in generic and principle matter. The end result should provide us an element in which the Hamas will understand that their calculation was a miscalculation, that Israel is not willing to take it lying down when you are raining thousands of rockets upon their head, when you're killing the civilians, when you're paralyzing their economy, when you're stopping the aviation to Israel, etc. So I can't, if the question is if I can detail a certain kind of an exit deal that will be sufficient for Israel, I can't do it right now at this point. But I can definitely tell you that it should include the fact that they have paid a price vis-a-vis their principles, vis-a-vis their assets, either intelligence assets, cyber assets, physical assets, personal assets, and they understand that it's not worth, at least for the next decade, to go against Israel once again. This is where we're coming from. Look, I mean, for Israel, the easiest thing to do, and this is what's, again, the biggest lie, is that Israel is using not proportional capabilities or military might. We are restraining ourselves every day. We have the ability to carpet the entire Gaza Strip, but we'll not do that because it's against our Jewish morale, it's against our Israeli morale, it's against our scopes, it's against our ethics. We're never going to do that. So we have to do it in a very smart way to hit only those who are committing these atrocities, human rights atrocities against us. So theoretically, it could be very easy. We can close the electricity in a second. We can take down the water in a second. But at the end of the day, we have an interest that they will live in a relatively stable situation because they are our neighbors. If your neighbor is going to be hungry, without water, without electricity, obviously he's going to take it against yourself in terms of aggression. So we're trying to seek that equilibrium. And there is no recipe to your question. I can't say, hey, it's 3 things, 1, 2, 3. But we know for a fact that the idea is not only that they will commit not to continue shooting, but they will understand that it's against their interest to do it, if that can be sufficient as a kind of a definition.
Thank you very much. I apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get to, but I'm going to hand it over to Miriam to close us out. Thank you again.
Hi, Miriam. You look younger on the Zoom. You're getting younger and younger, and I'm getting older and older.
Well, you just made my day. In a very
well, you deserve it.
Well, and when I say it's been a hard week, it's all relative, isn't it?
Yes.
We have not experienced anything like what our friends and family in Israel are experiencing, and we are so appreciative of you for briefing us today on this week's events. This week has really brought to mind one of the core functions of the JCRC, and that is to stand up in support of the state of Israel. Our Indianapolis JCRC has done that in several ways this week. We issued a statement condemning the violence coming from the Hamas rocket attacks and stating our support of Israel. We issued a statement expressing disappointment at Congressman Andre Carson's divisive rhetoric regarding Israel. We created a resource page on the JCRC website on the conflict, and that page will be updated as additional resources become available. You can find that on our website at indyjcrc.org. While you're on our website, please take a moment to register for our upcoming annual meeting. It will be held on Monday, May 24th at 6 p.m. That is a new date, Monday, May 24th at 6 p.m. Our keynote speaker will be Indiana's just recently appointed Secretary of State, Holly Sullivan, who actually traveled to Israel a couple of years ago with AIPAC. So she's a good friend of Israel and of the community. I want to thank our sponsors today, our statewide sponsors, as well as, of course, the Jewish Federation of Greater Indianapolis. This event was sponsored by the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne and the Jewish Federation of the St. Joseph Valley. We really appreciate having a statewide presence for Consul General Ezra's talk today. I want to also thank the JCRC's Israel Committee, our lay leadership, and of course, our amazing professional staff for all of the difficult but extremely important work that everyone has done this week. And thank you all to our attendees. We hope you will continue to follow the JCRC for additional information as there are new developments. And again, Consul General Ezra, thank you for not only today, but all of your support and friendship with the Indianapolis and Indiana Jewish community. It's been greatly appreciated.
Thank you, and really a huge toda rabba to all of you for caring for Israel, for standing for Israel, for working with JCRC in anything that is comfortable for you, from writing op-eds to working with members and elected officials, and doing whatever it is to stand for Israel at this juncture, because Israel needs you. And if we are not going to be active about it, each one has a role to really take this forward. So I really want to thank you, and also this opportunity invite you to a certain Zoom farewell party that the Jewish Federation here, under the circumstances of COVID, is throwing for me. But the silver lining is that many can attend from different kind of places, from South Dakota all the way to Detroit. So I look forward to seeing you. That's happening June 3rd, and want to thank all of you once again. Toda rabba.
Toda. We'll see you on June 3rd. Thank you so much. And thank you, Miriam and Eli. Thank you. This concludes our program.